during World War II, of course. As we heard earlier from Lon, during the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the government and the U.S. Army conducted the worst violation of civil rights against U.S. citizens in the history of the country. During the war, 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry were displaced from their homes. Most of them were on the West Coast. 110,000 of those were locked up in 10 remote camps, primarily in the West, although Rick told me there was also some in Arkansas. 5,000 others were deported to Japan. Now keep in mind, these Americans were never convicted or ever charged with any crime, yet they were incarcerated for up to 4 years in several cases. One such camp was in the harsh desert land of central Utah, 16 miles northwest of Delta. If you've ever been out there, it's pretty remote. I've been pheasant hunting out there. That camp was called Topaz War Relocation Center. The Topaz Relocation Center operated from September 11, 1942 to October 31, 1945. The square mile encampment, and Rick will tell us a little bit more about that, processed 11,202 individuals, most of them arriving at the camp with only what they had carried. To assure that that dark chapter in Utah and indeed in the nation's history is not repeated, or at least never forgotten, preserving a wonderful museum has been established out there to preserve and perpetuate that message and the courage that the people have out there. That museum was opened just 1 month ago in the city of Delta. The prime mover of that 30-year museum project is our speaker, Rick Okabe. Rick is a native of Chicago. He lived and worked in Silicon Valley until they moved to Salt Lake City in 1990. The internment story of the Japanese Americans is very close to Rick because his grandparents and parents who lived in Seattle in the 1940s were among those in prison, but they were in prison in a camp in Northern California called the Tule Lake Internment Camp. Although he was never incarcerated, Rick wanted to be sure the future generations were made aware of this incredible miscarriage of justice. So in 1994, he became a tireless volunteer for the board of directors of the Topaz Museum. And that board of directors oversaw the construction and the gathering of materials, archives, letters, and other materials that's in the museum. So from his vantage point of being on the board and being a major mover in the establishment and creation of this board, Rick is in an ideal position to tell us the story of the Topaz Museum and the people that are behind that story. So I give you Rick Okabe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I want to thank the Salt Lake Rotarians for inviting me here and my wife here today to enjoy this lunch with you and then to have the opportunity to talk about the Topaz Internment Camp and the Topaz Museum. As Mike just mentioned, the incarceration of 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry during World War II was a gross denial of constitutional rights. These folks were held in 10 prison camps behind barbed wire for over 3 years. They were not convicted of any crime. There were no trials. There was no legal representation. They just happened to look like the enemy. Since I was born after the war, I was not put in a camp, but my immigrant grandparents and my US-born citizens, my parents, were held in the Tule Lake Camp in California. My wife Karen's mother was held at the Hart Mountain Camp near Cody, Wyoming. It is because of my family's experiences that I've been involved with the Topaz Museum and been telling the Topaz story for almost 30 years. As was mentioned, the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941 was the beginning of the Topaz story. It immediately caused uncertainty and anxiety in every Japanese American community up and down the West Coast. Within 4 months of Pearl Harbor, people were being taken away from their homes. These are the posters that went up in every city along the West Coast that had a population of Japanese living there. The majority of Topaz internees came from the San Francisco Bay Area. Right. In April of 1942, these posters went up in every city along the West Coast. The military decided it needed to secure the West Coast from a potential attack by the Japanese. And so it established an exclusion zone from the state of Washington through Oregon, California, and Arizona. This map shows the 10 camps, including Topaz and Delta. It also shows the temporary assembly centers, which were basically racetracks and fairgrounds that were used to hold the internees for about 6 months while the permanent 10 camps were being built. Basically, people were given just a few weeks. Sorry, I'm not sure what I'm doing here, but people were just given a few weeks to dispose of their personal property, houses, and businesses. Because it was known that they were being forced to leave, they were offered 10 cents on the dollar, and in a matter of weeks, millions of dollars was lost. I have to point out the two highlighted terms that the government used to describe who had to go into these camps. The second paragraph reads, all Japanese persons, both alien, and this is the term that was used for immigrants who were not US citizens, who could not become naturalized citizens. So all Japanese persons, alien and non-alien. Well, if you were an alien and couldn't become a citizen, a non-alien obviously was a US citizen. But the government decided not to be so direct in explaining that they were taking US-born American citizens out of the homes without any rights. If you were 1/8 Japanese blood, you had to go into these camps. It didn't matter if you were young, a young child. It didn't matter if you were a senior citizen. It didn't matter if you were sick in a hospital. You were taken out of the hospital and forced to go into one of these camps. In its infinite wisdom, the government even took baby orphans out of orphanages in San Francisco and Los Angeles and put them into a camp in California. On the day of the removal, this is a shot in San Francisco, Japantown. Buses were lined up along the streets, along with just what you could carry, basically a couple of suitcases and some bedding. You didn't know where you were going. You didn't know how long you would be gone. In the case of the San Francisco Bay Area internees, they were first bused to the Tanforan racetrack of California, about 10, 12 miles south of San Francisco. hastily built camp. They put up some temporary barracks. They also converted horse stalls into living quarters for the first 6 months while Topaz was being built. In September of 1942, they were taken out of Topaz and put on trains leaving from Oakland for a 3-day trip to Utah. They arrived first in Delta and then were bused 16 miles outside of Delta to the Topaz camp. When they first got to Topaz, they were put through an intake process that consisted of filling out forms, going through a medical exam, being fingerprinted and photographed just like a booking process. Again, this was even though they had committed no crimes. They were issued an ID card and given a number, which they had to carry when they basically 24/7. This is a photograph taken from a water tower that had been constructed right on the edge of camp to supply water to the camp. It was 1 square mile, surrounded by barbed wire, along with guard towers manned by sentries with rifles and searchlights. In addition to the 1 square mile, 640 acres, the government acquired 19,000 acres around the camp itself in order to establish a dairy, a hog farm, a turkey farm, and enough land to grow vegetables to support a city, basically a city of 11,000 people. During World War II, Topaz was the 5th largest city in Utah. This is a little more detail of one of the 42 residential blocks. Each block had 10 wooden barrack buildings. Each barrack building was divided into 4 or 5 one-room, quote, apartments. Basically a 20-foot by 20-foot square area where a family of 4 or 5 would have to live for 3.5 years. In the center of each block were communal showers, latrines, and a mess hall. This is a sketch, since we don't have actual photographs of the interior of the barracks. This is a sketch that was done by the wife of a staff worker. So you see a family of 5, and again, a 20 by 20 room. Virtually, you had a single electric light bulb for light, a coal burning potbelly stove for heat, and 2 or 3 or 4 army cots. Everything else you had to scrounge or handmade. So in many cases, the internees were able to get scraps of lumber left over from the building of the camp or from shipping crates or materials that had been shipped in, and they built their own furniture. I note that the father in this picture on the left is using a barrel for a table and is sitting on a suitcase. This is a letter. Grace Oshta was a 17-year-old high school student when her family was taken from San Francisco to Topaz. Because her father was a prominent business owner, he had been arrested right after Pearl Harbor by the FBI. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the FBI's involvement a little bit later. But he was taken away to a military prison in North Dakota. And it was several months before Grace and her mother found out that where he was. Once they found out, they started to write letters. And so Grace and her father saved all of the letters that they wrote back and forth for about a year before he was reunited with the family. And I show this letter because you'll see that there are several words cut out of Grace's letter. And it's because all mail from the internees out or into the camp was censored. After the first year, the military decided that young men who were not trusted to be living on their homes in the West Coast would be trusted to fight for the United States. And so they opened up enlistment to any young men in any of the 10 camps. And quite a few volunteered, as was mentioned earlier, to fight for their country, even though their families were still in prison behind barbed wire. They fought in Europe in segregated units, in a specific segregated unit. And that unit, the 442nd, became the most highly decorated unit of the war for its size. Over 800 Japanese Americans gave their lives fighting for the United States. And you had the situation of mothers who lost their sons, grieving while they themselves were being held behind barbed wire. Topaz closed in October 1945. The majority of the Topaz internees returned back to the San Francisco Bay Area, where they had to struggle to rebuild their lives after the war. I mentioned earlier about the bombing of Pearl Harbor as being the trigger for the internment. However, the public feeling and the government feelings about the Japanese are feelings and prejudices and discrimination that have been building for many, many years prior to Pearl Harbor. It was not just that one incident that caused the internment. For example, in 1870, and this was 5 years after the Civil War and 71 years before Pearl Harbor, the Naturalization Act of 1870 was enacted, and it gave immigrants from Africa the right to become a naturalized citizen. That same 1870 Act denied the right to naturalization to Japanese American or to Japanese immigrants. And this is from this first act, because you could not become a naturalized citizen. That's where the term alien came from. And it's a term that is still in use today when you hear of illegal immigrants or illegal aliens. And it's a term, again, that has come to be used to equate immigrants as if they were from another planet, as if they were not good enough to become real Americans. Another example of discriminatory laws during that time, in 1913, California passed their alien land law. In the early days, many Japanese immigrants worked as laborers on farms. They worked very hard, and over a number of years, they wanted to buy land and start their own farms. The only farmland was generally soil that they could afford to buy, and land that nobody else wanted. But they were able to obtain that land. They were able to work it, and it became productive. But once that happened, they were viewed as an economic threat. So that's why, which prevented aliens from not being able to own land. Then in 1924, an Immigration Act was passed, which stopped Japanese from immigrating completely to the United States. And you'll note this newspaper article headline called it a Japanese ban. It was in effect until 1952, grandparents were able to finally become naturalized citizens. This ban also, because it was so effective in stopping immigration from Japan, I'd say it became a fairly effective wall against the Japanese and kept out the undesirable Japanese. Earlier, I had mentioned Grace Oshta's father, who had been picked up by the FBI. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, the FBI arrested prominent businessmen, ministers, and other community leaders that, for the purpose of, they did not want them to try to convince the Japanese Americans to either protest or resist the internment. So they ran around and literally arrested hundreds and hundreds of community leaders. They were working from lists of names and addresses that they had been compiling for a number of years. They had been developing a registry. And all this culminated in February of 1942 when President Roosevelt issued the executive order which authorized the military to set up the exclusion zones. It didn't authorize the military to build camps. It basically said you are authorized to exclude people that you feel are a national security threat. It didn't specifically say what to do with those people, but the military decided the best thing to do would be to build the tent camps. Today, this is what Topaz looks like. It is returned back to its natural state of greasewood and very dusty alkaline soil. However, if you go to Google Maps and search for Topaz Camp, this is what you find. From the satellite image, you can see that the camp is really still there. All 42 blocks are clearly outlined. The upper area was the administration area, a hospital, and housing for the military police. Our museum has raised funds over the last 10 or 12 years to purchase 634 of the original 640 acres of this camp. There are still original sections of the barbed wire. Now, frankly, the barbed wire is only about 5.5 feet tall. It's not very imposing, but you remember it's in the middle of the semi-arid desert. Even if you got under the wire, you would have no place to go. Delta was 15 miles away. And sooner or later, you would be recognized because you looked like the enemy. The other picture shows the concrete foundations of one of the guard towers. And if you look on the ground close enough, you will see remnants, things like the rocks lined up, which outline part of a path toward a barrack, and some Japanese dishware. In 2007, it was designated as a National Historic Landmark by the National Park Service. It recognizes the significance of Topaz in our country's history. It is one of 14 National Historic Landmarks in Utah. And I'm very pleased to tell you that this is the museum that we opened just last month. It's on Main Street in Delta. It's taken us close to 10 years to raise the money, design the exhibits, collect artifacts from former attorneys. And so we've been able to open this building, and I'd invite all of you to come down and visit. It tells much more detail what I've been able to tell you today. and I believe it's worth the effort. It does take about 2.5 hours to get there, but I believe it's worth the effort. Last fall, when a political action committee official stated that the internment of Japanese Americans served as a precedent for a Muslim registry, I became concerned. With the additional talks of bans and walls, it seemed like we hadn't learned anything from the story of the internment, which is the core mission of the Topaz Museum. In 1924 and in 1991, there was no one speaking out in support of Japanese Americans. Today, there are lawsuits challenging the executive orders. There are organizations, newspaper editorials, and individuals speaking out against the actions and rhetoric targeting various racial, religious, and sexual preference minority groups. I am hopeful that we will not let history repeat itself. Thank you. Hope we have time for questions and answers. I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Yeah, 2 questions. One, did lawyers or people not come forth and try to fight the ban? Did it go before the Supreme Court?
It did not. No, very few organizations and individuals spoke out. Officials were in favor of this. Civic groups were in favor of this. Newspaper editorials were in favor of the internment. So it really did not have the kind of groundswell of protest and resistance to this. Everybody was convinced. Again, the prejudice and discrimination against the Japanese had gone back 60 years prior. The immigrants were looked at as an economic threat. They were also looked at as being, again, different, too different. They couldn't really assimilate, particularly since you visually stood out. 4 individual Japanese Americans who refused the initial orders to go. And the ACLU in San Francisco, not the national ACLU, but the ACLU in San Francisco, agreed to help provide legal assistance to these individuals. But the challenges were turned down. And so those 4 folks actually ended up going to camps. 2 of them, Fred Korematsu and Mitsuo Endo, ended up in Topaz. Their cases were lost at the lower courts. Those cases were never ruled upon. They were never been able to be appealed to the Supreme Court. So it's never been actually ruled by the Supreme Court.
And then the second question, do you know much about how the camps were socially organized? I mean, you had all these people. Were they organized different kinds of activities? What was social life?
They tried to. There were a lot of kids, and so families. They were housed by families, as I mentioned, about 4 or 5 in one-room apartments. But they organized their own schools. Teachers come in from the outside, and also volunteers from within the camp. They set up recreation programs. They had baseball leagues of all things. In the American pastime here, they were playing baseball in the prison camps. They had football. They played the local high school football and baseball teams played the Delta high school teams. They had interchanges like that. They had the largest of the 10 camps, the largest art school. There were several professional artists from Berkeley who set up an art school, and at one time had 700 students enrolled. So it was a way to pass the time. It was also a way for the internees to express themselves because they were, imprisoned against their will without charges. Some of these black and white photographs that I've been showing you were taken by government-hired photographers. And they had specific instructions not to show photographs of the soldiers with rifles or the guard towers were the barbed wire. And so we have some original artwork, paintings and sketches done by the attorneys that do show the guard towers so it was more a realistic, true picture of the camp that was done by these art students. So we have a collection of over 100 original pieces of art.
Were the citizens allowed to vote?
No, because in order to vote, they weren't given absentee ballots, or you had to go back to your home district, and they weren't allowed to go back. Another right that they were denied for 3 years. Yes.
What about education? Were there teachers of Japanese descent or?
Both. There were teachers of Japanese descent. There were college students who weren't officially teachers, but they were recruited to teach. There were a few outside teachers who were brought in who volunteered to come into the camps to teach. They had 2 elementary schools and a high school. Yes.
What happened to the spouses of Japanese who were forced into this internment? If they were,
The spouses of who?
a Japanese person ordered to go to the camp, what happened to the American spouse?
Okay, there were cases where Caucasians, non-Japanese, were married to a Japanese. The non-Japanese did not have to go into camp. There was no requirement for that to happen. But if you think about it, if your spouse was forced to go someplace, into a prison camp, typically the spouse would go. So there were Caucasians in the camp that were not required to be there, but went there. Think about if you were, again, you were not Japanese, but married to a Japanese, and you had kids. You would take your spouse and your kids. Would you leave, stay just because you didn't have to go into the camp? In most cases, pretty much all cases, they went into the camp also. Yes.
You talk about some interaction between the athletic teams. Was there any other significant social interaction? Were there any social groups in Delta, for instance, that had some relationship, or were they just completely isolated?
I don't know specifically about Topaz. I do know a story about in Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Alan Simpson was a famous senator from Wyoming. Norman Mineta was the Secretary of Transportation during 9/11. He was a young boy in Heart Mountain, Wyoming, and he was a member of the Boy Scouts in the Hot Martin camp. Alan Simpson was a member of the Boy Scouts in Cody, Wyoming. They had some sort of an interchange in activities, and because of that, they became lifelong friends, starting from that Boy Scout encounter. Again, Alan Simpson became a senator. Norman Mineta became Secretary of Transportation, and they are friends to this day. Yes, sir.
How much contribution Japanese have made to this country since that time?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first part.
How much financial contribution?
Financial contribution. Well,
Japanese have made to this country, USA, since that.
Well, I can't give you a specific, you're asking about how much have the Japanese Americans contributed financially to the United States. I don't know that I can give you a dollar amount, but after the war, they had to go back to their homes, back to the cities where they had homes, if they still had homes. In many cases, they didn't have homes. They had to restart their lives and their families from ground up. And so over the years, my parents were from Seattle. They went to a camp in Northern California. There was actually a program, if you had a sponsor and a firm job offer away from the West Coast, you could actually leave the camp early. That's what my parents did. My father was a little older than the average Japanese American. He actually had a master's degree from University of Washington in chemistry, and he was given a job in an apple orchard in Idaho to analyze the pesticides. And he looked at that and said, well, working with pesticides or being in a prison camp, I'll take the pesticides. So he and my mother moved and then eventually moved their way across country to Chicago. And that's why I was born and raised. So a lot of families restarted their lives. On the whole, they did pretty well and became, upstanding citizens. I mean, they were citizens, but they reestablished their lives, reestablished their families, got jobs, and contributed like every other American family. Yes, sir.
I seem to remember 20 years ago under President Bill Clinton, there was some reparations or some compensation to Japanese families. Do you know the details on that?
Yes, in the 1980s, Congress authorized a commission, a national commission, that went to every major city across the country and took testimony from former internees. They also did research on all the 10 camps. They published a very lengthy report, and its basic conclusion said that the a failure of political and moral leadership, and authorized actually monetary compensation, which was $20,000 for every surviving internee. And I would submit, if I offered any of you $20,000 to be put in a prison camp for 3.5 years, I doubt if anyone would take that. So it was a token, but nonetheless, it was a token admission, along with a signed letter by the first President Bush to every former internee as an apology. And I would submit that that token compensation and that letter was pretty significant, because I can't remember many times where our government has apologized for anything. We had a massive recession in 2009 that I would submit was partly the fault of the government. Nobody has admitted to that or apologized to that. Yes.
Inside the camp, was there a post-exchange? I mean, how did people survive? Did the government provide clothing and food, and how were
they provided food?
Yeah.
I talked about the 19,000 acres, so they supplied the food, but everything else, there was a co-op basically run by the internees, and they could make buying trips to Salt Lake and bring back sell within the camp. They also did a lot of mail order through Sears and Montgomery Wards.
I'm interested in what your grandparents and your wife's grandparents wanted you to know about the experience. What was important for them, for you to know?
Actually, I didn't live with my grandparents. I didn't know them very well. They went back to Seattle. My parents, okay, and this is kind of true for most of my generation. I'm a third generation. My grandparents were the immigrants. My parents were the first U.S.-born children of my grandparents, and I'm the next generation. Frankly, my parents didn't talk about it much at all. I think that's true for Karen's parents too. And partly it's a Japanese cultural phenomenon. In Japan, there is a term called shigakukai, which is when you have something bad or traumatic, an experience, you sort of put it behind you and move on. The Japanese are not known for protesting and speaking out and being upset. It's a cultural thing that comes from Japan. And so my parents very rarely talked about it. The context, as I remember as a little kid, was they would have friends over for a dinner party or a bridge party, and I could overhear them talk about, oh yeah, Mr. Suzuki, he was in Camp Tule Lake in Block 25. To me, that sounded like summer camp. It wasn't until college where I started to read on my own about the internment and what it was all about that I became to realize what was really going on. And it was partly a way of embarrassment. I think I'm embarrassed by it. They worked hard to become productive, upstanding families in Chicago, and they really didn't want to talk about the past.
Were there Chinese citizens that were believed to be Japanese, and were they mixed in? And if not, were they discriminated against by
outside of the internment camp?
Chinese suffered the same type of discrimination. One of the immigration acts against the Chinese also stopped, against the Japanese also stopped Chinese immigration for a while. But there was this distinction made, and they were not put in the same camps. There were, I've seen one of these National Archives photographs of a sign on a business saying, "We are Chinese, not Japanese," during that time period. Yes, ma'am.
I think everybody would agree that this is one of the most shameful periods of the history of the United States. And I'm wondering if we are teaching our K through 12 kids about this period.
We're trying to, that's one of our missions of our museum. We've held annual teacher workshops to try to give teachers the resources and the training on how to teach about the internment in our schools, although it's not a requirement. That is something maybe that our museum can work on sometime in the future, but it is true that most history books, if anything, they offer a paragraph or two, and it really takes the initiative of the teacher to expand that and try to teach your students what the internment was really about. It's also, again, one of the main reasons why we developed this museum, because we want this story to be told.
What were the geopolitical circumstances in the time around the 1870 decision to ban Japanese citizenship?
I don't know. I haven't studied quite a lot about that period. I do know, if you look at the comparison between immigration from Europe coming through Ellis Island and immigration from Asia, Japan, primarily Japan and China, coming through Angel Island in San Francisco. I'll give you just a quick story about my wife and I went to Angel Island. It's a state park, and it's where an immigration station was set up in the early 1900s. We were talking to the ranger, and for immigrants coming from Europe, the processing time was typically a few days. On Angel Island, there's a restored wooden barracks where Asian immigrants were housed for literally months at a time, because the immigration officers were trying to do extreme vetting, basically, to make sure that the wrong people didn't come in. So they would be tested, they would be examined, they would have letters written back and forth between their hometowns. And so literally the difference in how they were processed said something about the fact that, and I think it's one, they look different than European immigrants. They eat with wooden sticks, which is kind of funny, they eat raw fish, which is, really exotic. It's this kind of demonizing anybody that doesn't look and sound like you. Oh, sorry.